If we are in a pretty relaxed state, or if we are happy, we generally feel like we can do what we want to do. We can maneuver through our environment. We can make choices that are reasonable, but oftentimes we're not in relaxed and happy states. That's just part of the human experience, obviously. And there's a fundamental feature to the nervous system, which is this thing they call the autonomic nervous system, which is just fancy nerd speak for the components of your nervous system that raise your levels of alertness or bring them way down. Sometimes we hear fight or flight, rest and digest, but basically what happens is when we are at the extremes of the autonomic, what I call seesaw, of very, very alert to the point of being really stressed or panicked or concerned, or if we are very close to sleep and we're drowsy and we're exhausted, at those points along the autonomic nervous system, our thoughts become a bit like a runaway train. You know, if you're very upset, it's hard to talk yourself out of it. If you're stressed, it's hard to think yourself out of it. In fact, you can start doing all sorts of third-personing and rationalization. You can call someone, you can text somebody. It's very hard to get yourself out of those states with thinking alone. But the beauty of the autonomic nervous system is that it traverses the brain and the body, and it connects to all the organs of the body. And it's a two-way street such that certain behaviors, even certain patterns of breathing, allow us to shift where we are on the autonomic continuum between very, very alert and stressed and very calm, and thereby give our mind a shift also in terms of the kinds of thoughts that we can entertain, the sorts of actions that we can engage in.
Need motivation?
Watch Top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle.
But you know you're capable of more, and you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best.
So today, let's learn from one of the best, Dr. Andrew Huberman, and my take on his top 10 words of success. Enjoy.
To make this concrete, if you're very, very stressed, or you're very, very upset, two things happen. One, it's very hard to take your focus off whatever it is that's upsetting you. And if you don't know what's upsetting you, you know, pure anxiety, but you don't know why, it's very hard to take your mind off of the feelings of anxiety. In those states of mind, there's another component, which is that for whatever reason, and no one really understands why this is, it feels as if the state that you're in will go on forever. Now, when we're in happy, relaxed states, rarely do we think, gosh, this is going to go on forever. And yet when we are in these unfortunate states of mind, we get the idea somehow, it sort of hijacks our perception of time, and we feel like this is never going to stop. If we turn to the body and certain behaviors, we talk about what those are, we are able to move ourselves along the autonomic continuum, and at that point, when we've done that successfully, and it's actually quite straightforward to do, we are able to think about things differently. We start to get a sense that the way we feel might not be the way we're going to feel forever. And it's in those shifts that we start to realize, my mind actually is not my best friend at these extremes, but there's a lot more to it. You're only getting the tip of the iceberg in those states. So that's why I say, if you can't control the mind with the mind, look to the body to control the mind.
Rule number 2, regulate dopamine levels.
When you deprive a kid of something that is very, very dopaminergic, that stimulates the release of a lot of dopamine, and then they actually have access to that at a friend's house or something of that sort, it is going to create a massive increase in pleasure. So I think there's this issue of, you know, not eliminating things, but having a controlled relationship to these very, very powerful stimuli. I mean, you know, movies are very powerful. You know, this is not the topic that we're talking about right now, but, you know, I get a lot of questions these days about dopamine and about pornography, for instance. Pornography, you know, removing all judgment from this, because that's not what the basis of the conversation is. Pornography has created an enormous number of problems in certain countries in the last 10 years, mostly because of its immense availability and the intensity of the images. It's also wired up a lot of young brains to become aroused watching other people have sex as opposed to being in the physical act of sex themselves. So there's a lot of, like, you can't even call it third personing, and they're not, you know, they're aroused by imagery that they're not actually participating in. And I get a lot of questions about this, especially from the younger audience. So am I saying all pornography is bad? No, not necessarily. I don't know. Any discussion about sex and sexuality, I always say we're of course framing it in the context of age appropriate, consensual, context appropriate, species appropriate. But the point is that, you know, anything that stimulates a lot of dopamine release is a very sharp blade. So if you eliminate it, completely, great in the short term, potentially treacherous in the long term. That kid goes to a friend's house and sees, a movie. Let's just remove pornography from the conversation.
Or get a bag of cookies.
Yeah, a bag of cookies. Suddenly it tastes candy for the first time, and the brain is hardwired to get very, very excited about that. So then now you're dealing with a kid that potentially could get even more addicted to these things. So it just has to be controlled. It has to be controlled. Any potent stimulus, highly processed, highly palatable food, visual imagery, movies, has to be controlled.
Rule number 3, get rid of obsessions.
If we were to draw a line between the obsessions and the compulsions, that line could be described as anxiety. Now, we need to define what anxiety is. And to be quite honest, most of psychology and science can't agree on exactly what anxiety is. Typically, the way we think about fear is that it's a heightened state of autonomic arousal, so increased heart rate, increased breathing, sweating, etc., in response to an immediate and present threat or perceived threat. Whereas anxiety, generally speaking in the scientific literature, relates to the same sorts of thought patterns and somatic bodily responses, heart rate, breathing, etc., but without a clear and present danger being in the environment or right there. So that's the way that we're going to talk about anxiety now. And anxiety is really what binds the obsessions and compulsions, such that someone will have an intrusive thought. So for instance, someone will have the thought that if they turn left on any street, that something bad will happen. Okay, that's an obsession. It's actually not all that uncommon. Now, how bad and what the specificity of that bad thing really is will vary. Some people will think if I turn left, something generally bad will happen. It just makes me feel anxious, so they always insist on going right. Whereas other people will think if I turn left, so-and-so will die, or I will die, or something terrible will happen. I'll get a disease, or someone else will get a disease, or I'll be cursing myself or somebody else in some very specific way. This is unfortunately quite common in people with OCD. So they have this feeling, and the feeling can be generally or specifically related to a particular outcome. But beneath that is a feeling of anxiety, a quickening of the heartbeat, a quickening of breathing, a narrowing of one's visual focus. I've talked about this before on other podcasts, the Master Stress and other podcasts, but if you haven't heard those, let me just briefly describe that when we are in a state of increased so-called autonomic arousal, alertness, stress, etc., our visual field literally narrows. The aperture of our visual field gets smaller, and that's because of the relationship between the autonomic nervous system and your visual system. So you start seeing the world through sort of soda straw view or through binocular-like view as opposed to seeing the big picture. Why is that important? Well, it literally sharpens and narrows your focus toward the very thing that the obsessions and the compulsions are focused on. So the person walking down the street who sees the opportunity to go left or right will only see the bad decision. Their visual field narrows very tightly along that possibility of taking a left turn. And I know as I describe this, it seems totally irrational, but I want to emphasize that the person with OCD knows it's irrational. They might feel crazy because they're having these thoughts, but they know it makes no sense whatsoever that left somehow would be different than right in terms of outcomes in this particular case. And yet it feels as if it would. In fact, in some cases, it feels as if they went left, they would have a full-blown panic attack. So the idea here is that the obsessions and compulsions are bound by anxiety, but then by taking a right-hand turn, again, in this one particular example, by taking a right-hand turn, there's a very brief, I should mention, very brief relief of that anxiety at the time of the decision to go right, not left. And there's an additional drop in anxiety while one takes the right-hand turn as opposed to the left-hand turn. And then, as I alluded to before, there's a reinforcement of the compulsion. In other words, by going right, it doesn't create a situation in the brain and psychology of the person that, you know what, I'm not anxious anymore. Left would have probably been okay. It reinforces the idea that right made me feel better, or turning right made me feel better, and going left would have been that much worse. Again, it reinforces the obsession even further. And again, we could swap out right turns and left turns with something like hand washing, the feeling that something is contaminated and the need to wash one's hands, even though one already washed their hands 20, 30, 50 times prior. And we're actually going to go back to that example a little bit later when we talk about one particular category of therapies that are very effective in many people for OCD, which are the cognitive behavioral and exposure therapies. Because I think some of you have heard of cognitive behavioral and exposure therapies, but the way they are used to treat OCD is very much different than the way they're used to treat other sorts of anxiety disorders and other sorts of disorders generally. So it's fair to say that up to 70% of people with OCD have some sort of anxiety or elevated anxiety, either directly related to the OCD or indirectly related to the OCD. And it's really hard to tease those apart because OCD can create its own anxiety. As I mentioned before, it can even increase its own anxiety. And there's also an issue of depression. Having OCD can be very depressing, right? Especially if some of these OCD thoughts and behaviors start to really impede people's ability to function in life, at work and school and relationship. They can start feeling less optimistic about life. And in fact, some people can become suicidally depressed. That's how bad OCD can be for us. So we have to be careful when saying that 70% of people with OCD also have anxiety or X number of people with OCD are also depressed, because we don't know whether or not the depression led the OCD or the other way around, or whether or not they're operating, as we say in science, in parallel. Some of the drug treatments for OCD and depression and anxiety can tease some of that apart, and we'll talk about that. But I think it's fair to say that what binds the obsessions and compulsions is anxiety, that there's a feeling of it, or I should say an urgent feeling of a need to get rid of the obsession, and the person feels as if the only way they can do that is to engage in a particular compulsive behavior.
Rule number 4, balance social interactions.
When we lack social interaction that we expect, we become prosocial. However, if we are chronically socially isolated, meaning we don't have interactions with people for a long time, we become actually more introverted. This is separate from all of the tachykinin stuff that I talked about earlier, or falling into states of chronic stress. But it's well established now that in humans and in animals, if you don't give them enough social interaction, they actually become antisocial. And so this is actually a little bit like what one might see with long-term fasting. Okay, I give the example of eating every 4 hours. Now let's give the parallel example of somebody who's been fasting perhaps for 2 or 3 days. If they are expecting to eat and then the meal doesn't arrive, they are not necessarily going to immediately try and seek out food. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. You would have thought, well, they haven't eaten in a very long time. They're going to be very motivated to seek out food. But no, they are accustomed to fasting. Similarly, this social homeostasis circuit works in a way such that when we don't have social interactions for a very long time, we start to lose our craving for social interactions.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, change your belief system.
If you give people a little bit of an understanding of the underlying mechanisms, it creates a system around any tool that makes it easier to do that practice and makes it more impactful as well. So what I mean is, I could do a whole episode just listing off tools and protocols for everything from fat loss to focus and attention, mental health, depression, trauma, grief, etc., based on the data. But if I start each episode, which I do, with a little bit of a description of the mechanism, for instance, how cold impacts metabolism, how, for instance, a particular childhood attachment pattern to a parent translates to an adult romantic attachment pattern. Then when I go into some of the description about the tools, my hope is that people will have those mechanisms in mind, or even just subconsciously they're embedded. And then not only are they going to be more willing to lean into those tools, but those tools will be more impactful. And the last thing I'll say about this is I have a colleague at Stanford. I should introduce you guys because she'd make a phenomenal podcast guest. Her name is Allie Crum. Aaliyah Crum. She is a tenured professor at Stanford. She's a trained clinical psychologist. She was a Division I gymnast, and she's a martial artist. And she works on beliefs and belief systems. And she has incredible data showing that the result of anything you do or what you eat is both the consequence of that thing. So like she's done experiments, for instance, where they give people milkshakes and they tell them, okay, this is a low calorie milkshake, or they tell people this is a high calorie, nutrient dense
And it's a regular milkshake.
It's a milkshake. People drink that and they measure subjective reports of how fulfilling that and how much satiety, how much satisfaction it provides and for how long. And they measure hormones, insulin, ghrelin, all the hormones that are the consequence of eating. And what you find is that what they find is that if people are told this is a high calorie, nutrient dense shake, it provides much more satisfaction for much longer than if they're told that it's a low calorie, nutrient sparse shake. And the hormones that one secretes in response to that milkshake differ in the two groups, even though the milkshakes are absolutely identical.
Because it's all about your beliefs.
It's in part about your beliefs. Because of course, if, you can't tell yourself that the entire chocolate cake is, just a bowl of broccoli, and it's going to have the same effects as a bowl of broccoli. So anything you do, whether or not it's exercise, cold bath, what you consume is the consequence of that thing. There's some undeniable, non-negotiable realities about your biology. And then there's the belief system. And the other example I'll give is they've done these beautiful studies where they tell one group, listen, stress is a part of life and it gives you dementia. It makes your thinking suffer. It can kill neurons. It can do all this terrible stuff. They tell another group, all that's true, by the way, in certain contexts. They tell another group, stress is a part of life, but it can sharpen your thinking. It can bring out your best. It can stimulate your immune system as long as it doesn't last too long. And what they find is that the biological effects of stress on those two groups match what those people are taught about stress.
Wow.
And so you can't get around the realities of stress or calories or things of that sort. There's the laws of physics and the laws of biology, but belief systems have a powerful role in how the tools and practices that we engage in shape us. And so that's the logical backbone for teaching people a bit about the mechanism. Because if I say, hey, do an ice bath, it increases your metabolism, increases your resilience, and can reduce pain and inflammation, help you sleep better at night, great. But lots of people are saying that. But if I say, listen, there's this pathway where when you get into cold water and it's really uncomfortable and you really want to get out, but you stay in for an extra minute, you stimulate this certain adrenaline-related pathway in your brain and body. Now, when you do it and you hit that wall, you're like, I really want to get out of here. You think, no, I want to stimulate that pathway. And then your belief and understanding about that pathway really does shape the fact that it works. And so teaching mechanism is in part for me about educating and turning people on to the beauty of biology. But I realize, look, not everyone wants to be a biologist or a researcher, but I think everybody wants better mental health, physical health, and performance. And so mechanism has a real impact.
Rule number 6, shift your perspective.
Next, I'd like to talk about some of the research on and the roles of hormones in OCD, because it turns out to be a very interesting relationship there. But before I do, I want to point out something that I realize I probably should have said earlier, which is one of the key things for someone with OCD to come to understand if they're going to experience any relief of their symptoms, whether or not they're doing drug treatments or behavioral treatments or otherwise, is that thoughts are not as bad as actions, right? Thoughts are not as bad as actions. One of the kind of rules that people with OCD seem to adopt for themselves is that thoughts are really, truly the equivalent of actions. So they'll have an intrusive thought, and we haven't spent too much time on this today, but earlier I touched on the fact that some of the intrusive thoughts that people have in OCD are really disturbing. They can be really gross, or at least gross to that person. They can evoke imagery that is, toxic or infectious, or is highly sexualized in a way that is disturbing to them, can be very taboo. This is not uncommon when you start talking to people with OCD and you start kind of pulling on the thread. Again, this would be a psychiatrist who was trained to ask the right questions and gain the comfort and trust of a patient. They start to reveal that these thoughts are really intrusive and kind of disturbing, which is why they feel so compelled to try and suppress them with behaviors. One of the powerful elements of treatment for OCD is to really support the patient and make them realize that thoughts are just thoughts. and that everyone has disturbing thoughts, and that oftentimes those disturbing thoughts arise at the most inconvenient and sometimes what seems like the most inappropriate circumstances. And this relates to a whole larger discussion that we could have about what are thoughts and why do they surface, and how come when you stand at the edge of a bridge, even if you do not want to jump off, you think about jumping off. And, this has to do with the fact that your nervous system as a prediction machine is oftentimes testing possibilities. And sometimes that testing goes way off into the netherlands of the thought patterns and emotional patterns that we all have inside of us. The big difference between a thought and an action is that, of course, the nervous system is, in one case, not translating those patterns of thinking into motor sequences. That nerdy way of saying thoughts aren't actions, believe it or not, can be helpful for people if they really think about that and use it as an opportunity to realize that, first of all, they're not crazy. They're not thinking and feeling this stuff because they're bad or evil. And of course, sometimes this can cross over with other elements of life where we place moral judgment on people for certain behaviors. I think that's part of a healthy society, of course. That's why we have laws and punishments and rewards, for that matter, for certain types of behaviors. But this idea that thoughts are not as bad as actions, and that thoughts can be tolerated, and the anxiety around thoughts can be tolerated and over time can diminish, that's a very powerful hallmark theme of the treatment of OCD. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Thoughts are not actions. Actions can harm us. They can harm other people. They can soak up enormous amounts of time. Thoughts can soak up enormous amounts of time. They can be very troubling. They can be very detrimental. We, of course, want to be sensitive to that. But when it really comes down to it, the first step in treatment for OCD is this realization, or the approach to the realization that thoughts are not as bad as actions.
Rule number 7, learn how your brain works.
People vary in the extent to which they feel or have the capacity to feel bonded to anyone. And it is now generally understood that some of that variation might depend on variations in oxytocin receptors, or what are called gene polymorphisms for oxytocin. Genes can have a number of different sequences in them. They're nucleotide sequences. We won't go into genetics right now. A's and G's and C's and T's in various combinations are what make up the genes. Genes are transcribed into RNA. RNA is translated into proteins that affect cells, okay? The oxytocin gene encodes for oxytocin, and variants in that gene change the amount and function of oxytocin. There's a really interesting study published just this last year in a relatively new journal. The journal has a kind of an unusual name. It's Helion. I think it's Helion and not Helion, but Helion, Heliyon. This is a Cell Press journal. As far as I can tell, it's a very solid journal. Certainly the Cell Press label is very stringent. And this paper is entitled The Relation Between Oxytocin Receptor Gene Polymorphisms, which just means changes in genes or variations in genes, adult attachment, and Instagram sociability, an exploratory analysis. This is a really wild study, but I like the study. It's very thorough. First author, last name Carollo, Carollo. And what they found was that by analyzing the genetics of different individuals who are on social media and looking at how many people those individuals follow and how many people follow them, and what they come up with is a so-called social desirability index, they were able to correlate in a very straightforward way that people that carry certain variants in the oxytocin and oxytocin receptor genes actually seek out more online social Instagram interactions. So some people I know, I won't name their names, only follow, anywhere from 0 to 6 accounts. Other people follow thousands of accounts. And they take the ratio of how many accounts people follow versus how many followers they have. Arguably not a perfect measure, but a nice one in the sense that you can do this in a completely unbiased way with many, many thousands of subjects. And then they were able to get genomic analysis from a number of these subjects. And it turns out that people who have, let's say, higher levels of oxytocin function or potential levels of oxytocin function actively seek out more social interactions on social media. So this, I think, represents an important first in the area of how social media and data from social media are starting to merge with biological data in terms of predicting how avidly people will seek out social interactions of an online type. And nowadays we hear a lot about how online we are connected, but we're not really, we're communicating, but we're not connected, or the connections aren't real. I think we're going to need to revisit that. While I'm certainly a believer in the idea that face-to-face communication and common interactions with people standing in the same space or playing sports together, enjoying music together, enjoying meals together is vitally important. There's an entire generation or several generations of people that are coming up who much of their social interaction has been online. And if you think about it, all of the things that we've spelled out earlier about common mental narrative, this left brain system a la Alan Shore, or autonomic bonding, or synchronization of heartbeats according to common stories, all that is happening in online social interactions. When 1,000 of us look at the exact same Instagram post, yes, we will have 1,000 independent responses to that, but chances are many of us have a similar or same response based on the data that we talked about earlier in synchronization of heartbeats. And so we are socially bonded with other people through social media, and it's very apparent that the oxytocin system is playing some role in that. And this, if we zoom out, makes perfect sense because, again, dopamine, serotonin, prolactin, oxytocin, none of these systems were placed in us or are organized within us in order to encourage specific and only specific types of social interactions. The one that we can say is absolutely critical is the child-parent interaction, right? Because children simply can't take care of themselves. They need a caretaker. I should have said caretaker, not parent. But infants, if they're not taken care of, will die. But beyond that, we have evolved or come to realize many different types of social interactions. And online interactions nowadays are very, very common. I'm certainly involved in them. I'm guessing you're involved in them as well. We're involved in one right now, for example. The oxytocin system is absolutely threaded through and largely responsible for those types of social bonds as well. And incidentally, Oxytocin is the name of the 5th song on Billie Eilish's 2nd album, Happier Than Ever.
Rule number 8, reduce caffeine and alcohol intake.
Violent aggression is entirely appropriate at a professional boxing match, provided it's occurring inside the ring and only between the competitors and within the bounds of the rules of the sport, etc. However, there are some things that tend to bias certain social contexts toward being more aggressive or less aggressive, and not always physical aggression. And those generally come in 2 forms that many of you are familiar with, which are alcohol and caffeine. Let's discuss caffeine first. Why would caffeine increase aggressive impulsivity? Well, the general effects of caffeine are to increase autonomic arousal, the activity of the so-called sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, which is, to put it very much in plain language, it's the alertness arm of your nervous system. That is, it creates a sense of readiness in your brain and body, and it does so by activating the so-called sympathetic chain ganglia. Again, as I always remind people, sympa and sympathetic does not mean sympathy. Sympa means together or all at once, and caffeine tends to bias our brain and body to activate the sympathetic chain ganglia, which run from about the base of your neck until the top of your pelvis, and deploy a bunch of chemicals that jut out into the rest of your body, activate adrenaline release. There's a parallel increase of adrenaline in your brain, creating the state of alertness and readiness. That state of alertness and readiness can be for all sorts of things, not just aggression. However, when we are in a state of increased sympathetic tone, meaning more alert, such as after drinking caffeine, we will bias all those brain and body systems, the hormones, the chemicals, etc., that exist toward action as opposed to inaction. So put simply, caffeine can increase impulsivity. No surprise there. On the opposite end of things, alcohol tends to decrease activity in the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, tends to make us feel less alert. Now, initially, it can create a state of alertness because of its effects in inhibiting the forebrain. Our forebrain prefrontal cortex in particular has what's called top-down inhibition. It exerts a inhibitory or a quieting effect on some of the circuits of the hypothalamus, such as the ventromedial hypothalamus. The way to conceptualize this is that your forebrain is able to rationalize and think clearly and to suppress behavior and to engage the no-go pathway. It's telling you, don't say that, mean thing, don't do that violent thing, etc. Alcohol initially tends to increase our level of overall activity by reducing inhibition, not just in that forebrain circuit, but in other circuits tends to make us more active. We tend to talk more than we normally would, move more than we normally would, but very shortly thereafter starts acting as a sedative by way of reducing activity in the forebrain, releasing some of the deeper brain circuits that are involved in impulsivity, but also causing a somewhat sedative effect. And then, of course, as alcohol levels increase even further, people eventually will pass out, blackout, etc. So what we've got with alcohol and caffeine is we've got two opposite ends of the spectrum. Caffeine increasing arousal and readiness and the tendency for impulsivity, and alcohol also increasing impulsivity, but through a different mechanism.
Rule number 9, focus on service.
I believe that, tattoos are, this has come as no surprise, are a literal expression of what we feel on the inside. And I'm not recommending this. Kids, don't do this. I started getting tattooed really young.
How young?
About 14, I got my first tattoo.
No way.
We did them ourselves. With India.
Your first one was yourself?
Please no one do this. India ink and a needle. And we used to do these. It's really bad. They're called knick-knack tattoos, or we kind of would do this at home. Don't do it. It's really bad. You get bad infections. They're ugly. They blur. They bleed. It's not good. I started getting tattooed. When I was a kid and growing up skateboarding in the punk rock scene, there were these guys that in the town where I lived, they called themselves the Yahtzee guys. I don't know why. I don't know what that was about. But they all had full sleeves, and they were super nice guys, and they were all into skateboarding and and vehicles. And I just looked up to these guys. I thought, someday I want full sleeves. I've got full sleeves. I'm basically like neck to wrist.
So chest piece as well?
Yeah, but chest covered. Back's covered, yeah. Nothing on my legs, nothing on my stomach, ribs, yeah. Tops of my shoulders. And I got a big picture of Costello, my dog, back there. I've got a picture of his paw back there. I've got a picture of another dog I used to have. There's still some space for a few things. There's some things very personal to me.
Is that the reason that you prefer not to show them?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple reasons. I'll just be clear as to why. First of all, when I show up to podcast, it's the same way I show up to lecture in the classroom auditorium. And I swear on my life, this is my mindset and this is my mantra when I do it. I'm there to teach. It's not about me. It's about the student. It's about the people learning. I don't want it ever to be about me. I don't want the focus to be on me. Obviously I'm the voice and the person talking, but I really want people to internalize the information. And I do think that the tattoos, because they have nothing to do with the information, are a distraction. They're just a distraction. I don't know. It would sort of like be wearing like a bright yellow shirt or something. It's not my style. I prefer to kind of make myself disappear as much as I can, and let the information come forward. That's, even when I gave scientific lectures, which I still do, of course, for my professor job, I generally liked the room to be pretty dark, and I wanted the light to be on the data, on the slides. I was happy to be the voice, but I want people thinking about the data. So podcasting is a little different. So you come through as a voice, or on YouTube, a voice and an image, but I really prefer that it not be about me. Now, there's a human element too, and I think things have changed a lot. When I was growing up, tattoos were not accepted. There are many work environments where, if you have, for instance, where people prefer that their surgeon or their doctor not have tattoos. Some people might prefer their surgeon or doctor have tattoos. When I was growing up, if you had I never had one, but if someone had a nose ring, they had to cover it up with a Band-Aid or take it out if they worked at the coffee shop. Remember that? You probably don't. You're probably young enough.
No.
Or eyebrow ring. Trends have changed, right? Yep. Things have changed. And I'm kind of old school because I'm kind of old now, 46. And the etiquette for me has always been to, and this is Lex does this too, is I personally find that if I can just show up as formal and consistent as possible, that people will at least know that I'm taking them seriously. So I don't really do it for me. I pretty much do it for the audience. And also, none of the tattoos are like that interesting. It's my dog. I really like raptors. I've got a bunch of birds. I have all sorts of different things.
Like raptors, like the dinosaur?
No, raptors like red-tailed hawks and blue. I like birds and things like that.
I had either dinosaurs or trucks.
Yeah.
You really need to love Ford Raptors.
No Ford Raptor. I drive a Toyota 4Runner and I love it. I've got one truck and I love that thing. Although with gas right now, you kind of got to wonder about having a gas-driven vehicle like a 4Runner. in any case, yeah, the tattoo thing, I would say for younger people coming up, just be aware that you can't control other people's perceptions either. And so, I always made it a point that I didn't want things on my knuckles. I didn't want them on my hands. I didn't want them on my neck. I didn't want them on my face. Do I judge people when they have them? No. But do I want them for me? No. I also think that, and this is very neuroscience-y, as a neuroscientist, that we have dedicated brain areas called fusiform gyrus. It's a face area that's dedicated to the processing of faces. Even if I just put 2 dots and a line in between them on a piece of paper, you see that as a face. When one puts a tattoo on their throat or on their face, it actually changes the way that the face is perceived, right? I mean, it almost looks like another mouth there, right? It's a very different look. It can be a little bit jarring. I'm not saying one shouldn't have it, but it can be a little bit jarring. It changes the look of the person forever. It's not just that it's above the neckline, it's that it kind of competes with the processing of their face in its normal way. And so for me, whenever I see somebody with a throat tattoo or a face tattoo, it's sort of like, it's hard to kind of orient around that. And I think there's some biology that relates to that. But look, when it comes down to it, I mean, people need to be individuals and live their life the way they want to live their life. I've also never been that much of an iconoclast. I'm not, I grew up in the punk rock thing. I hate in-group, out-group stuff. I always had friends from a lot of different, friends that are jocks and hippies and punk rockers and, straight and gay. And I don't care as long as people are living their best life and they're not harming anybody. I'm great, go for it. I'm very laid back in that way. Of course, if people are harming other people, then I believe that liberty and independent freedom. I mean, liberty is, one of the highest things, for me. So, but I don't consider myself a very judgmental person, but you can't always control the perceptions of others. So I would just think people should be thoughtful about what they want to accomplish in life in terms of a life mission, and just ask whether or not some of the permanent cosmetic changes they might make might align with, compete with, or be neutral for those life missions. My life mission is very simple. I want to teach people the beauty and the utility of biology. I'm going to do that today. I'm going to do that until I take my last breath in one form or another, because that's what excites me, and that's what keeps the dopamine cranking.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is prevent social isolation.
For better or for worse, there is a tremendous literature on the biology of social isolation and all of the terrible things that happen when animals or humans are socially isolated at particular phases of life. Now, for those of you that are introverts, you are not necessarily damaging yourself by deciding to spend less time with other people. Many people like time alone. I personally am an introvert. I get a thrill out of spending time with 1 or 2 close friends, but I enjoy a lot of time by myself. I like to socialize, so I wouldn't call myself an extreme introvert, but I know there are some extreme introverts out there. But when we talk about social isolation, what we're referring to is when animals or humans are restricted from having the social contacts that they would prefer to have. And to just briefly touch on the major takeaways from this literature, which spans back 100 years or more, being socially isolated is stressful. And one of the hallmark features of social isolation is chronically elevated stress hormones like adrenaline, also called epinephrine, like cortisol, a stress hormone that at healthy levels is good for combating inflammation, helps us have energy early in the day, focus throughout the day. But if cortisol is elevated for too long, which is the consequence of social isolation, the immune system suffers and other chemicals start to be released in the brain and body that are designed to motivate the organism, animal or human, to seek out social bonds. An example of one such chemical is a peptide called tachykinin. Tachykinin is present in flies, in mice, and in humans. And under conditions of social isolation, its levels go up. And because of the brain areas that contain receptors for tachykinin, people start feeling very aggressive and irritable after social isolation. Now, that should be a little bit counterintuitive to you. You would think, if you isolate an animal or human and then you give them the opportunity for social interaction, they should behave very well. They should be thrilled. They're finally getting the nourishment, the social nourishment that they've been lacking for so long. It turns out that's not the case. Chronic social isolation changes the nature of the brain and body such that it makes social connection harder, and it makes the person who's been isolated irritable, even aggressive with other people. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into the biology of social isolation because it doesn't actually afford us that much insight into what healthy social bonding looks like. So today we're going to focus more on the functional biology, dual meaning of the word functional, as opposed to the pathology of social isolation. However, I do want to point out that social isolation starts to deteriorate certain aspects of brain and body pretty quickly. But how quickly depends, again, on how introverted or extroverted somebody is. So if you're somebody who's socially isolated for the holidays or has been socially isolated for a period of time and is craving social contact, that is a healthy craving. And as we'll learn next, the healthy craving for social contact has a very specific brain circuit, has a very specific neurochemical signature associated with it, and has some remarkable features that you can leverage in social contacts of all kinds. I think some of the more important and exciting work on social bonding comes from the laboratory of Kay Tai. Kay is a professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. She's an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And in recent years, I would say in about the last 5 or 6 years, her laboratory has made a fundamental discovery as to why we seek out and put so much effort into social bonds. And the key discovery that she made is that much like hunger, much like temperature, much like thirst, we have brain circuits that are devoted to what's called a social homeostasis. Many of you have probably heard about homeostasis before. Homeostasis is the characteristic of various biological circuits and even individual cells to try and maintain a certain level. It's most easily thought of in the context of hunger. If you don't eat for a while, your drive to pursue food and think about food and make food and spend money on food and indeed to enjoy food goes up. Whereas when you're well fed, you don't tend to seek out food with as much vigor or as much intensity. You wouldn't invest as much time, effort, money, etc. So homeostasis is the aspect of cells, tissues, and organisms to seek some sort of balance, to regulate themselves. In a crude way, you can think about the thermostat on your home as a homeostatic circuit. When the temperature goes up a little bit, it cools things down to maintain a certain temperature. When the room gets cold, it hits a certain level and a sensor detects that, it clicks on, and then the heat goes on to maintain a certain set temperature. So that's a simple way of thinking about homeostasis. Every homeostatic circuit has 3 components, or at least 3. One is a detector, meaning the organism or the thermostat on your wall has to have some way of detecting what's going on in the environment, all right, in the context of social bonding, whether or not you are interacting with others and whether or not those interactions are going well. So that has to be detected. That's the first thing. Then there has to be a control center. That's the second thing. And the control center is the one that makes the adjustments to, in the case of social bonding, to your behavior and to your psychology. So you'll soon learn that there are ways in which the more time that you spend alone, the more motivated you are to seek out the pictures of faces, the interactions with actual people, physical contact, and so forth. Now, that might seem obvious to you, but thanks to the work of Kay Tai and others, it's remarkable to learn that there are specific brain centers that are adjusting our psychology and biology so that we seek out bonds more aggressively, or maybe we don't because we are perfectly sated or satiated with respect to how much contact we've had with other people. Now, the third component of this homeostatic circuit is the effector. The effector is actually what drives the behavioral response. It's what leads you to pick up your social media and start scrolling. It's what leads you to text a friend. It's what leads you to call a friend or make plans, and what leads you to follow through on those plans. So again, those 3 components are a detector, a control center, and an effector. And as you'll soon learn, the neural circuit that controls this social homeostasis actually has a 4th component, and that 4th component is one that places subjective understanding as to why you are doing what you are doing and establishes your place in a hierarchy. Now, I know the word hierarchy can be a little bit of a barbed wire one because people immediately start thinking about boss and subordinate, or in couples, a leader and a follower. But when we talk about social hierarchies, in the context of human interactions, social hierarchies are very plastic, meaning in one setting, one person can be the leader. In another setting, the other person can be the leader. You probably have groups of friends or family members where you're constantly passing the baton as to who's going to drive, who's going to navigate, who's going to pick the restaurant, who's going to clear the dishes, and who's going to do certain activities and not others. So hierarchies are very dynamic. And as a consequence, social bonding has to be very plastic and very fluid so that you move from one environment to the next. Even with the same people, you have to be able to make those adjustments. And in the case of the social homeostasis circuit, those adjustments are made by a particular brain structure. I've talked about it on this podcast before. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It is the seat of our higher consciousness, if you will. It's what allows us to place subjective labels on things so we are not strictly input-output. We are not robotic. Meaning, if you go to dinner with a friend and they are exceptional at choosing restaurants, well, in the context of this social homeostasis circuit, your prefrontal cortex would allow them to pick the restaurant because basically they are dominant over you in their capacity to pick good restaurants, at least in this example. Whereas as you leave that restaurant and perhaps you are navigating to where to get a drink after dinner or where to walk through the city, perhaps you have the better sense of direction. And so then the social bonding has to be maintained as you switch the hierarchy. Okay, so that's the role of that fourth element, the prefrontal cortex. We've all heard the sayings, how do you journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. Or how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Mm-hmm. Or, there are all these sayings, and it goes back to the Bible and earlier, right? I mean, this is not new. These are not new sayings, but they're showing up in different forms. What's lost in those short descriptions, however, is that every step is not equivalent. If it were just that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, everyone would pursue their goals. Everyone would push back against adversity. You can read the inspirational stories as many times as one needs, and I do think inspirational stories are of very high value. In fact, I think they're vicarious dopamine. I think they give us the sense that we could, which then orients hope, which then orients us to the world again.
So right. Maybe it's possible for me.
That's right. So let's say, let's take the example of somebody who's...
but just to finish that story of, it's not about just taking a single step and one step at a time. Is it because there's adversities every 10 steps you go, and so it's harder and harder? So it's not just
it's just very nonlinear. It's some days go, I know this from my scientific career, it's, some days it's easy, some days it's hard, it's all over the place, right? So I think the thing to remember is that dopamine is this incredibly powerful molecule that allows us to buffer the effort process. It allows us to be in effort longer, and it allows us to actually eventually enjoy the process of effort.
And not think about the reward, but just say, I'm enjoying the process.
Right. Well, you just described the first step. The first step in learning to attach dopamine to the effort process, which is the key operation in order to succeed, is to be very careful about how much you focus on the end goal. Keeping the goal in mind is important for like a proper orientation. You have to know the ultimate destination. But if at any point we were to evaluate our progress relative to that end goal, or if we don't know what the end goal is, there's a huge gap there. Right. And it can feel overwhelming.
And depressing, and I'm not good enough.
That's right.
I should just give up. What am I doing this for?
That's right.
And those thoughts will affect us.
And they're very realistic, right? Yeah. I mean, as Carol will say, and other people have said in the psychology field, positive self-talk, oftentimes, unless you do it correctly, you're badly wrong. Lying to yourself won't work. Saying I'm a winner when you haven't lost or you haven't won yet is great, but that's not the most effective use of these systems.
Well, you're also being out of integrity with yourself. You're telling yourself a lie.
Right.
You're like, and then you're losing your ability to have confidence because you're just lying to yourself.
Right. And if it's really extreme, there's a name for it. It's called delusional, right? right. And people will start to point that out, and then it becomes harder to recruit people into your goals. So I think the key thing is to attach that sense of reward to the effort process. It's saying, look, I am oriented in the right direction and rewarding the things you're not doing. I'm not back on my heels. I'm not just staying, in bed in the morning. A good example of this came to me recently. I have a good friend. He did 9 years in the SEAL teams. His name is Pat Dossett. And we were talking about, the Admiral McRaven thing, get up and make your bed. And, and they really do that. And I think the way it was described was So at the end of the day, even if everything doesn't go well, your bed is still made. For me, that's not that big of a reward, frankly.
Right.
So I said that, and
I love it though. I make my bed.
I definitely make my bed in the morning, but I mean, going back and seeing that at the end of a hard day, it's not enough. I felt like there was something else there. So I asked him, he said, well, it's very interesting because part of it is about not just making your bed, but it's the things you're not doing by making your bed. You're not lying in bed and ruminating. You're not back on your heels.
You're not on your phone.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when you look at, and you have spent a lot of time with people in high-performing communities, mainly through some consulting work, but what you find is that, we can all either be back on our heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass.
Yeah.
And when you look at people who are in these high-performance communities, they try and keep their center of mass forward, almost through what seem like trivial things like making your bed or making the cup of coffee. But it's not just about what you're doing, it's all the things you're not doing that can put you down the path of ruminating or put you down the path of unhealthy behavior. So the key to this is, if we want to be very concrete, we should probably focus on actions. And I'll use fitness as an example because it translates to everybody, whereas people's circumstances differ. Let's say somebody really wants to take on a fitness routine. They hate running, or they want to lose weight in a healthy way, this kind of thing. So we've all heard the example, well, you put your shoes by the door on day 1. Day 2, you put them on. Day 3, you go out the door. Day 4, you walk around the block, and then, and then eventually like they're running marathons. Okay, great. But to sustain that behavior, or even to make the behavior pleasurable and to give you energy, the key is to subjectively reward those steps. So it's not going to be, let's say I go out and I run a mile, and my goal is to run 10 miles in a few weeks. The key is, as you're in the strain of that mile, the hard part, you want to tell yourself, this is the good part. This is the part that gives me energy. And I'll be very surprised if people don't actually feel like they could continue further. So it's a journey of 1,000 miles starts with is made up of, single steps. But the key is to reward the harder steps, not the easier ones, and not the ones where you get the thing that you want.
Don't reward yourself for putting your shoes on and taking a step outside.
You could if that was a huge barrier for you.
If it was very hard.
If it was very hard for you.
But running the 10 miles is hard.
Right. Find the wall and push a little bit further through that wall and reward that process. So this is why I think reps in the gym, the final reps, like reps to failure, are usually not the best example. First of all, most people aren't doing reps to failure, and it doesn't translate to young kids and stuff where they probably shouldn't be doing heavy reps to failure, this kind of thing. What you want, however, is if you're going to go there, to think about this is the hard part, because that's when adrenaline, norepinephrine are getting maxed out, and that's when you have an opportunity to bring dopamine in and teach those neural pathways to slam that back down. And I don't want to highlight them too much because they are a very niche and specialized community, but you look at people in special operations, you look at the process, like the whole evaluation process of who gets in and who doesn't. It's really about putting people into stress and seeing who can not just make it through that stress, but buffer that stress. Reward the process through teamwork, reward the process of stress through some internal dialogue that has everything to do with not being back on your heels, not being flat-footed, but center of mass forward. And I should also be clear, I'm not talking about everybody being super aggro and always like,
work. Yeah.
In fact, if you're spending too much epinephrine, if you're too much of an adrenaline junkie, you will burn out eventually, unless you can find ways to recover yourself or to buffer that with dopamine. And the recovery process is especially important. There's a second reward system. So you've got the dopamine system, and I guess to really put a box around it, the subjective reward needs to be done at the hardest portion of a process. The tough conversation with a significant other, it's like when it's really tough and that's when you want to start telling yourself, this is the good part because I'm not speaking, or this is the good part because
I'm not reacting.
Right, I'm not reacting, or this is the good part because I'm probably not doing it correctly, but I'm on the right path, right? They're upset, they're not feeling your empathy, this kind of thing, or you're not really understanding what's going on, you're getting frustrated. But if you tell yourself, this is the neural pathway getting ground in there, like it really dialed in, so that the next time I'm going to breeze right past this. Yeah. That's really how the process works. Because remember, no one comes along and drips dopamine in your ear, even if you get $1 billion, or you win a Nobel Prize, or you win the presidency. It's all internal. These neurochemicals are all internal. And while some of them are designed to be released in response to things very reflexively, like food, sex, sleep. All these things will trigger these neurochemicals. We have this big forebrain, which allows us to place subjective context on things. And whether or not that competition is with, mental material like books and studying, or whether or not it's physical competition, we need external influences. Like, I think these days we're so attracted to the idea that we can, control everything from the inside, but you need human interaction. It's absolutely necessary. And I think that, it sort of harkens back to the story at the beginning. It's like all the stress that I was going through in those years. I mean, it absolutely made me better, right? Absolutely made me better. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I don't wish hardship on people, but humans are remarkable in their ability to step into challenge and to meet challenge. I think that there's this important and very, very serious conversation now about mental health, right? The number of people suffering is just tremendous. But I think that we also are forgetting that, that suffering process it's a jumping off point, right? And I've had a number of friends commit suicide. I understand just how, that's a horrible tragedy, and depression is absolutely terrible. But there's also this question of, sort of like, what is our expectation about our mood, right? Like, what are we really trying to achieve with our moods? And so I always say, there are 5 things that embody our whole existence. It's like our sensations, what we feel, our emotions, our perceptions, our thoughts, and our actions. That's pretty much it. And of all of those, the emotions are the most mysterious. It's kind of a combination of perception and thoughts. You can control your behavior. You can control your thoughts. People often forget this, but your thoughts are your choice, right? I'm not saying you can suppress thoughts. I think there's been a lot of attention on trying to learn how to suppress thinking. I've never been able to suppress thinking, ever. But what I can do is introduce new thoughts. Actually, Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, brilliant author and ex-military guy, he really, I think he said something like, he was like in his mid-40s before he had his first real thought. And what I like to think he was referring to was the first time that he realized that you could actually introduce a thought, that thoughts aren't just all spontaneous, so they can be deliberate. Your sensations you can control by your environment, and your perceptions are largely about kind of like what sense your thoughts about what you sense, right? But your feelings, I think we overvalue feelings. And here I'm going to come across as, kind of a hardened male and about this. I would place myself actually kind of on the wide emotionality scale. But I've learned over the years that emotions are just kind of a mishmash of perception and thought. I think we overvalue their utility. And this is just my opinion. I don't have any scientific data to support it, but I also don't even know how you study emotions in the lab. Every time I see a laboratory that claims they study emotions, they're studying behavior. Every time people are talking about fear and about courage, they're talking about a behavior that's measured. We don't know what these animals feel. We don't have the foggiest. I don't know what you feel right now. I barely understand what I feel right now. So I think that as a species, and in terms of mental health, we've been over-focused on feelings, and I think we need to think more carefully about physiology. The discovery of growth mindset is worth thinking about. So Carol's discovery was these kids that, for whatever reason, liked doing math problems, even though they knew they couldn't get the answers right. These were sure-fail problems. So it's the same kind of people that like doing puzzles. And these kids, not surprisingly, go on to do phenomenally well in a number of different areas of academic pursuit. But what's interesting about growth mindset is that it seems like there's some attachment of the reward systems of the brain to the action or the pursuit of a goal, not just achieving a goal. And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into 2 categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have. Love of your dog, love of your spouse, gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin. Okay. But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal. I'm going to build my company. I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is. And you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset in its purest form is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining. It's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine. Both those things, breathing and vision, also run in reverse, meaning if we change our pattern of breathing, we change our inner state. If our state changes, our breathing changes. So it's reciprocal. It's bidirectional. Likewise with vision, when we are excited or stressed, the aperture of our visual window shrinks. We get that soda straw view of the world. When we are relaxed, the aperture of our vision expands. But as well, it runs in both directions. If we expand our view of the world, literally force our visual field, or just, it's very easy actually. You can do it no matter where you are right now. If you just try and expand your visual field, not by looking around or moving your head or eyes, but by trying to see yourself in the environment that you're in. So you literally dilate your view so you could see the ceiling and the floor and the walls if you're inside, or if you're outdoors, seeing as big an aperture of your visual field or your visual environment as possible.
So you're directing your attention to, even though you might remain looking straight ahead, you're just directing your attention to as wide a peripheral view, horizontally and vertically as possible. Is that what you mean?
That's right. Exactly. So essentially, if you keep your head and eyes mostly stationary, you don't have to be, rigid about rock steady. But if you look forward and you expand your field of view, so you kind of relax your eyes so that you can see as much of your environment around you as possible, to the point where you can see yourself in that environment. What you do is you are turning off the attentional and, believe it or not, the stress mechanisms that drive your internal state towards stress. This is why when you go to a vista or you view a horizon, it's very relaxing, because you naturally go into panoramic vision. When you are indoors, you're looking at your phone, you're looking at a computer or a camera or something of that sort, or you're talking to somebody or an intense conversation, you may not notice it, but your entire visual field shrinks to a much smaller aperture. And that drives an increase in alertness in internal state. And we sometimes call that stress if it's a negative experience. If it's a positive experience, we might call that love or obsession or fascination. But the important thing to realize is that both vision and breathing have a profound and very rapid effect on our internal state of mind and body. And it runs in both directions. Our internal state that could be triggered by a text message or hearing something that somebody says drives changes in our breathing and our vision. But our breathing and our vision can also drive changes in our internal state. And so that article in Scientific American was a discussion about how we can leverage the visual system and the respiration, the breathing system, in order to take control over our internal state. Because it's not just that 2020 was stressful. It's that our internal state determines everything. It doesn't just determine if we feel like we're having a hard time falling asleep or we're having a hard time focusing, for instance. It also determines how we batch time, how we analyze where we are in the world in terms of our lifespan. A good example of this would be when we are very stressed, we fine slice time. This is why when people are in a car accident or something, they might report that things were in slow motion. They're actually, your frame rate increases. Whereas when you're very relaxed, your frame rate slows down. And when we are relaxed, we get so-called perspective. We are able to say, well, this too shall pass, or I can place this stressful event in a context. So one thing that's just fundamental to how our nervous system works is that we are constantly placing our experience, both our immediate and past experience, as well as our anticipation of the future, into some sort of larger context. And our visual system, literally how we are viewing the world at that moment, dictates how we create perspective in terms of states of mind. Sounds a little bit abstract, but it's actually, it boils right down to optics of the eye and very concrete things like how you move your eyes and how you view the world. In fact, there's a much better way to maintain ongoing action toward a goal that also involves visualization, but it turns out it's not about visualizing success, it's about visualizing failure. The Balcetis lab and other labs have looked at whether or not people make progress toward goals of different types, whether or not they're thinking about the goal, they're thinking about that goal line and what they want to achieve, that long-term goal and all the wonderful things associated with it, or whether or not they're thinking about all the ways in which they could fail en route to that goal. Right? This is not typically what we are encouraged to do. Typically, we are told, don't imagine failure, push failure out of your mind, only focus on success, fake it till you make it, or it's a phrase that I absolutely hate, frankly, because it's not even clear what that means, and it's not even clear what the ethical form of that is. I think it means continue despite any anxiety or fear that things won't work out. But if you look at the literature, the scientific literature, what the Balcetis lab and other labs have shown is that there's a near doubling in the probability of reaching one's goal if you focus routinely on foreshadowing failure. You think about the ways in which things could fail if you take action A or you take action B, and instead, therefore, you take action C. You're supposed to think about how things could fail if you don't get up and run each morning if your goal is, say, a fitness goal. So let's use that as an example, because even though I realize people are in pursuit of many things, not just fitness goals and physical goals are a very concrete thing that we can all get on the same page about because they're related to actions. Let's say somebody sets a goal of running 5 miles 4 times a week minimum and as many as 7 4 times a week minimum before 8 a.m. Okay, in a previous podcast on habits, I talked about the benefits of not necessarily setting specific times that one will do things, but setting time blocks that one will do things. So you say before 8 a.m., you're going to run 5 miles, and that's going to happen up to 7 days a week. Okay. One version of this would be, okay, sit back in a chair and think about how great you're going to feel and look if you're doing this every day, how your health is going to improve, how everything's going to, your blood markers of lipids, et cetera, are going to improve. Okay, fine. That's the visualization goal of visualizing the endpoint. Turns out that is far less effective and maybe even counterproductive compared to thinking about what's going to happen if you don't do this. The negative health outcomes that are going to occur, the disappointment you're going to have in yourself, the fact that you're going to wait until 7:30, that's not long enough for many people to run 5 miles. You go to put it on your shoes, it's going to be pouring rain or even hailing or snowing outside, and now you're not going outside unless you're somebody who's particularly motivated to do that. Okay? So foreshadowing failure turns out to be the best way to motivate toward goal pursuit. In fact, as I mentioned before, there's a near doubling in the likelihood that people will reach goals of any kind when they're constantly thinking about how bad it's going to be if they fail. If we think back to the neural circuit associated with assessing value in our goal pursuits, this makes perfect sense. The amygdala, that center of the brain that's involved in anxiety and fear and worry, well, the amygdala is one of the 4 core components of our goal setting and goal pursuit circuitry. And there's no bypassing that. There is no one listening to this or watching this whose amygdala is not involved in their goal setting and goal pursuit behavior. And so while I'd love to be able to tell you that all you should think about is rainbows and puppies and all the wonderful, rewarding things that are going to happen when you achieve your goals, the truth is you should be thinking mainly about how bad it's really going to get if you don't do it, how disappointing in yourself you're going to feel, how it will negatively impact you, if not in the immediate term, in the long term, if indeed your goal is to reach your goal. So I want to emphasize that I'm not interested in encouraging people to flagellate themselves. I'm encouraging people to achieve their goals. And it turns out the best way to do that is by foreshadowing failure. And the more specific you can get by writing down or thinking about or talking about how bad it will be if you don't achieve your goals, the more likely you are to achieve those goals. I really believe that we all have some superpower that reflects, maybe this is a bit of a scientific explanation, that reflects the fact that our biology is tilted in some direction. People often think about their biology being tilted in a direction that doesn't serve them, like, oh, you know, my parents were this, or or I'm not a good athlete, or I'm whatever. But it's also tilted in the direction of something really special. So like when I was a kid of that age, I was fascinated by animals. I was just like and so had I learned to listen to that more, I used to hide my interest in animals because I thought it was kind of it wasn't cool. Like I didn't play the guitar in college, I didn't surf. I always like I can tell you all these facts about mustelids and ferrets. Like what good is that? But but I think that kind of leaning, that kind of tilt towards like that's me. Like you resonate with something. And I'm not the first to say this. I think Robert Greene also said this. Like adults will often remember back to a time where they interacted with something. Sometimes it's an object or sometimes it's an experience, and it just felt so good. Like it kind of drew you in. I would tell your young listeners and viewers to really pay attention to that. It can seem almost trivial, like it's rarely about the thing you're looking at or the thing you're doing, but sometimes it's the sensation of running. Sometimes it's the sensation of seeing something or hearing something, because there's a hint there, and it's not really about what you're looking at or you're doing. It's that feeling. Like learn it. That feeling is your compass. Like that's your true north. Because that's the feeling you want to get to find, the mate for your life, the partner for your life, the career track. And over time, you're going to pivot, right? I mean, you're not going to get it on the first try. My story of science started there. It told me right there. I felt it in that conversation with my dad, and then my compass was all over the place and spinning, and eventually it's come back. I found it, but get in touch with that feeling. And if this seems at all abstract, I would do it as an experiment. I would sit in a chair and I would think about something you don't like really don't like, and I would pay attention to what that feels like in your mind and in your body. I'm not a very somatic person. I'm not somebody who feels stuff at the level of the body. I've always felt like my emotions were in my head. So when people talk about their emotions in their other places, I'm just I don't get it. But I would encourage them to think about that, and then I would encourage them to think about something they really like. It could be roller coasters, could be music, could be, get specific and to get in touch with that feeling. And that feeling is your guide. Yeah. That feeling is your compass. Because the nervous system, it's not mystical. The nervous system will orient toward the things that it's best equipped to do. It really will. And animals do this naturally. My bulldog Costello never tries to be a different kind of dog. He never fetched once. First time I threw the ball, he walked to the ball, he sat down with the ball, he destroyed the ball. Because that's what bulldogs do. Throw it to a retriever, they bring it back. Because the brain of the retriever is wired to feel good by retrieving. Yeah. And the brain of the bulldog is good to feel good by being horizontal and pulling on things with they like to tug. So I think humans, we're similar enough, but we're different in the sense that you have something installed in you that feels right, and getting in touch with that feeling is key. And I should tell that you're not going to get it right away. This is a practice you learn, like shooting basketballs or math. You do it over and over but if you get started young at 8 or 9, oh my goodness, great. And if you do it when you're 12 or even if you're 60 and you do this, you'll find that pretty soon you start steering in these directions. And I do believe it's a neural There's a real physical substrate for this. It's not mysticism. I'm never going to argue that we can subjectively control all of our experience, because there's some things that just genuinely suck, right? And it's important to register those not so great events or terrible events, because they can drive us also. You know, we can be driven from a place of anger, frustration, and you know, revenge, or we can be driven from a place of, you know, love, gratitude, and et cetera. I'm not here to judge which one is better or worse, but the nervous system doesn't distinguish between them. So if you're the kind of person that needs to, you know, kind of budge yourself into something, great. If you're the kind of person that wants to do things from more of a warm, fuzzy feeling, that's fine too. What I will say is this: the ability to tap into this dopamine reward system, which is activated anytime you're in pursuit of something that's outside the boundaries of your skin and literally the boundaries of your body, as well as the reward system, the serotonin oxytocin system, which is really about the things that are contained within your own body and immediate experience, things like gratitude and, you know, touch and comfort and things like that with loved ones. The ability to tap into both is crucial. Now, you said something really important, which was, well, negative thoughts, what to do. I don't believe that it's very easy to suppress negative thoughts. However, when you realize that thoughts can be deliberately introduced, you can start replacing negative thoughts with new types of thoughts. So you can always add something in. But when people start to realize that thoughts are very much like physical actions of reaching and picking up a glass of water, or taking a jog around the block, or typing an email perfectly. This is something I sometimes do because I struggle to do the perfect email. Not all my emails are perfect, but when I do one, I make sure that I complete it and I think, okay, it's possible. It's not because the email being perfect is so important. It's because I want to remind myself that my thoughts and my actions are essentially the same. The nervous system can organize thoughts. So for somebody that's struggling, you know, we have these examples like, oh, they were really back on their heels, or they were so depleted, no money and all this stuff. What are they going to, we have so many examples like that, but in trying to make it actionable, it's really about saying, yep, that's all true, but I'm going to introduce a thought, which is, I made it through today. I made it through today, and that's actually worth celebrating at a micro level. So if you can give yourself dopamine rewards in small increments, right? You're not trying to celebrate that you made it through one day. Sometimes that's a huge feat, but most of the time, you just want to dose yourself with a little bit of that internal release of dopamine. You start rewarding incremental steps. And if there's anything that your listeners could take away from this whole thing about dopamine and reward schedules and being in movement, it's reward incremental steps, in particular, incremental steps that are about forward action. So maybe that's writing an email. Maybe that's that run around the block. Maybe that's something much grander for you. As you get better at things, right, the stairs get further and further away from one another because you've achieved more success. And so they tend to be, you have to take the rungs on the ladder further apart, so to speak. That's a time when you really need to implement not only the dopamine rewards, but also those serotonin and oxytocin rewards, et cetera. So to make it actionable, I would say, remember, don't spend so much time trying to suppress negative thoughts. If you need trauma therapy, pursue that with a professional. But if you have negative thoughts, just remember, I can also introduce positive thoughts. The same way I can control running around the block. Positive thoughts are the equivalent of forward physical action. And if you reward them internally, you buffer yourself against the quitting circuit, this norepinephrine circuit we were talking about before. You are building a stronger version of yourself completely between your own ears. And some people say, well, that's silly. It's like you're saying, oh, I'm going to jump up and down, reward myself for doing nothing. No, you're building the neural circuits that you can control self-reward. And in doing that, you can push through days and weeks of effort consistently. I don't mean necessarily all-nighters, but you can push and push and push. Growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really two things. One is I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, two things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press Journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain.
With more effort, we're
every time you put in effort. So every time you make, for this, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time you, let's see, it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. Now, at some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort. And they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward in kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you anyone the feeling that you could continue, and maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk. I mean, they have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it. For any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor. And the reward system, you start to realize, is entirely internal. No one's coming along and cramming dopamine in your ear or dripping it in your brain. It's all internal. And this starts to bring us into the kind of like discussion around mindsets. Because so my colleague Carol Dweck, who popularized this theme, growth mindset, it's, again, a very misunderstood concept. It's the idea that we can change, so that's built into that. But the discovery of growth mindset was of these kids that actually really enjoyed doing problem sets that they knew they couldn't get right. But for them, they would get this like dopamine release from just focusing on the problem. They liked doing puzzles they couldn't get right. It sounds crazy, but inevitably those kids are very good at puzzles and very good at math and these kinds of things. So growth mindset is, I believe, if it's sort of a neuroscience lens on growth mindset, would be that the agitation and stress that you feel at the beginning of something and when you're trying to lean into it and you can't focus is just a recognized gate. You have to pass through that gate to get to the focus component. And then if you can reward the effort process, you really start to feel joy and low levels of excitement in the effort process. That's that buffering of adrenaline. That's that feeling like, yes, I've got a lot of adrenaline in my system, but I'm on the right path. It feels good to walk up this hill, so to speak. And when you start to bring those neural circuits together, you really start to create a whole set of circuits that are designed to be exported to any behavior you want. So if it's writing a book, great. If it's podcasting, great. If it's building a business, great. If it's building a terrific relationship, great. Then the circuits that Mother Nature has designed are incredibly generic so that we could adapt to whatever it is that we need to do. And I think the misunderstanding around how these circuits work has led to this idea that there's some secret entry point, maybe marked flow on the door, and there's a trampoline up to that door, and you just open that door and you're going to be in it.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And anyone who's done well in any career or athletic pursuit knows this, but unfortunately, there's a kind of obsession with the idea that it's all supposed to feel good. And it does feel good, but there's a whole staircase in which it feels kind of lousy. To what extent does our subjective narrative,
the story we tell ourselves,
actually mean something for the body? And to what extent does the body actually mean something for the subjective narrative? So this gets into some areas of work that we're doing now. And so I do want to highlight that it's ongoing work. But I think, the old narrative, meaning 10 years ago, was that if you're feeling depressed, just smile. Well, if that worked, we would have a lot less depression than we see out there. The reason I call it a brain-body contract early on is that the brain and the body are constantly in dialogue. So, the idea that when we're depressed, we tend to be in more defensive type postures. When we're feeling good, we tend to be in more like relaxed and extended postures. All true. But it does not mean that just by occupying the extended posture that I'm going to completely shift the mind. That's a first step. Think about like two interlocking gears. It's one gear that turns the other, but then they need to kind of dance together before you can get the whole system going.
So how do you get it to dance together?
Exactly. So there is one way in which subjective thought and deliberate thought is very powerful over states of mind and body. To answer your question, can you think your way out of the ice bath being cold? So a couple things that are important. First of all, just to go a little deeper on what thoughts are. Thoughts happen spontaneously all the time. They're popping up like a poorly filtered internet connection. But thoughts can also be deliberately introduced. For instance, right now, I can say, okay, have a thought that just decide to write your name. And you can do that. I'm going to decide to write my name, and you can do it. So that's a deliberate thought, which says that you can introduce thoughts. So I think it's very hard to control negative thoughts directly by trying to suppress them. Generally, they tend to just want to continue to geyser up all the time. But we can introduce a positive thought. And this is what people from elite special forces can do. They know how to make small, simple, physical steps in the real world that allow them to build on these reward circuitries, but they don't get delusional about how they're doing. They know, they keep the end in mind, but they get very micro. They move the horizon in very close. And so if you can move the horizon to something you know you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before. You're just as strong, if not stronger, but you're heading in the direction you need to go. You're not depleting. You're not spending out anything. And it feels a little weird because none of us like to reward things that aren't external. But the ability to control these internal reward schedules is everything. An ability to control your levels of stress in real time is extremely powerful. It turns out you can do this using physiology and neuroscience. Your breathing can directly impact your heart rate and your level of stress or calm. Here's how it works. When you inhale, your diaphragm moves down. This creates more space in your thoracic cavity, and your heart actually gets a little bit bigger. As a consequence, the rate of blood flow through that larger heart volume slows down. A signal is sent from a group of neurons on your heart called the sinoatrial node. That signal goes up to the brain, and your brain sends a signal to speed the heart up. In other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. The opposite is true as well. When you exhale, your diaphragm moves up. Your heart gets a little bit smaller because there's a little bit less space in your thoracic cavity. As a consequence, blood flows more quickly through that smaller volume. The sinoatrial node registers that and sends a signal to your brain, and the brain sends a signal to slow the heart down. So in other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up, Exhaling slows your heart rate down. So if you want to speed up your heart rate and be more alert, inhale more or make those inhales more vigorous, more intense. If you want to calm down, you can do that quickly by making your exhales slightly longer than your inhales or making them more vigorous. This doesn't require any breath work. This is something that you can do in real time. And that's what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's the technical phrase. It's also the basis of what's called heart rate variability, or HRV. But all you need to remember is inhaling deeper and longer will speed your heart rate up. Exhaling longer and more intensely will slow your heart rate down and will allow you to calm down in real time.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag Believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome.
For 10 more amazing rules from Dr. Rahul Jandayal, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and we'll see you there.
The best way I can explain it is, as you grow, the brain, the way the electricity flows, the way the connections prioritize, is a bit like skiing down a mountain. It starts creating these electrical grooves of sorts.